Dr. Helen Pritchard worked as a forensic pathologist in Manchester, England for 24 years before the exhumation in September 2016 showed her that cemetery administration could fail so completely that families could be burying the wrong people for decades without anyone knowing. She'd supervised over 400 disinterments, had seen administrative errors and misidentifications, had dealt with complicated forensic situations, but she'd never opened a casket expecting one person and found someone completely different. Never held a coffin plate that said George Hartley while staring at unmistakably female remains. Never confronted a mystery that had no solution. Because they never found George Hartley. Never found where he'd actually been buried. Just found the woman in his grave. The woman nobody recognized. The woman who'd been lying under George's name for 40 years. I met Dr. Pritchard at her home in Cheshire in October 2024. She'd retired 6 years earlier, but had agreed to discuss the case because, she said, it deserved documentation. Deserved to be known. Deserved to remain unsolved publicly, rather than buried in closed files. We sat in her study, surrounded by medical texts and certificates, and she told me about the day they opened George Hartley's grave and found someone who shouldn't exist. George Hartley died on March 15, 1975. Dr. Pritchard said, her hands folded in her lap. He was 62 years old. Heart attack. Died at home in Salford. His wife Margaret found him. Standard death. Certificate signed by his GP. Funeral 4 days later at St. John's Church. Burial at Weast Cemetery. George had been a postal worker. Married 38 years. 3 children. 2 daughters. And a son. After George died, Margaret had continued living in their home, raising the children who were teenagers at the time. She'd remarried in 1983, lived a full life, died in 2014 at age 91. In 2016, George's children, now adults in their 50s, were settling their mother's estate, Dr. Pritchard said. There was a dispute. The son, Dennis Hartley, claimed his father had left a will that gave him specific property. His sisters disagreed. The will couldn't be found, and Dennis claimed it had been buried with George in his pocket, said his mother had put it there at the funeral. The sisters, Patricia and Joan, had no memory of this, said their mother would never have buried an important document. But Dennis was insistent. He'd petitioned the court for exhumation, wanted to check George's burial clothing for the will. The court had approved it. Routine exhumation for document recovery, not unprecedented. September 23, 2016, Dr. Pritchard said. That's when we did the exhumation. I was there as the supervising pathologist. Dennis Hartley was present, as were his sisters. Their solicitors were there. The cemetery superintendent. Everything properly documented. Weast Cemetery is an old cemetery in Salford. Established in the 1850s, thousands of burials over more than a century. George's grave was in Section D, Plot 247. The cemetery records were clear. George Hartley, buried March 19, 1975. Plot assigned, all paperwork in order. The crew excavated carefully, Dr. Pritchard said. Reached the burial vault by 10 a.m., pulled it up. It was a standard concrete vault, showing 41 years of ground contact, but intact. We opened it. The casket inside was in poor condition, wooden casket, significantly deteriorated, but structurally present. The coffin plate was still attached to the casket, tarnished brass. Engraved clearly, George Hartley, 1913 to 1975. Beloved husband and father, exactly right, exactly what should be there. We transported the casket to the mortuary for opening, Dr. Pritchard said. I wanted controlled conditions, proper lighting, documentation equipment. This was a legal matter, potentially going back to court. Everything needed to be recorded properly. The casket was placed on the examination table. Dr. Pritchard and her assistant prepared to open it. The Hartley siblings and their solicitors observed through the viewing window. Dr. Pritchard explained what to expect. After 41 years, the body would be largely skeletal. Clothing might be partially preserved. The search for the will would require careful examination. I opened the casket, Dr. Pritchard said quietly, and I knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. The body inside was skeletal, as expected, after 41 years. But the skeleton was not George Hartley's, was not male at all. The pelvis structure was unmistakably female. The skull showed female characteristics. The bone structure, the frame size, all female. I closed the casket immediately, Dr. Pritchard said. Told everyone we had a situation. Asked the Hartleys to step out. Then I reopened it and examined more carefully. Female skeleton, 5'3" or 4", based on bone length. George Hartley had been 5'10", according to his death certificate. The remains were wearing a dress, not a suit. A dress, significantly decomposed, but identifiable, and jewelry, a wedding ring, a necklace, female jewelry. I called the cemetery superintendent immediately, Dr. Pritchard said. Told him we had the wrong body. He insisted that was impossible. Said their records were perfect. Said we must have excavated the wrong grave. But I showed him the coffin plate. George Hartley, 1913 to 1975. We had the right casket, wrong body. The cemetery superintendent had brought the burial records. Section D, plot 247. George Hartley, buried March 19, 1975. Adjacent graves, plot 246. Elizabeth Norton, died 1958, plot 248. Thomas Walsh, died 1982. No record of any female burial, in plot 247. No record of any administrative error or correction. We checked the adjacent graves on the map. Dr. Pritchard said. Thought maybe there'd been a mistake in the plot numbering. But the geography was clear. We'd excavated from the exact location the records indicated. Plot 247, where George should be. Where a woman was instead. Dr. Pritchard had documented everything. Photographed the remains, the casket, the coffin plate, collected samples for DNA analysis, then sealed the casket and had it stored in the mortuary while they investigated. The police were called, Dr. Pritchard said. This was potentially a criminal matter. Misidentification, improper burial, possibly fraud. They opened an investigation. The investigation started with the assumption that this was an administrative error from 1975, that somehow George's body had been switched with another body, that someone had been buried in the wrong grave with the wrong identification. But how, and who was this woman? We ran DNA analysis on the skeletal remains. Dr. Pritchard said. It took 3 months, but in December 2016, we got results. The DNA matched a woman named Catherine Flynn. She died on March 16, 1975. One day after George Hartley, at Salford Royal Hospital. Catherine Flynn had been 71 years old, widow, no children. She died of pneumonia. Her death certificate was on file, and her burial records showed she'd been buried at Weiss Cemetery on March 20, 1975. Section D, plot 249, right next to George's plot. We checked plot 249, Dr. Pritchard said. Catherine Flynn's grave. And we found something impossible. Her grave showed no signs of disturbance. It was exactly as it should be. Maintained. Her headstone was in place, and when we exhumed it, when we opened that grave, we found it empty. Not completely empty. There was a casket, wooden, deteriorated, but inside, nothing. No remains, no clothing, no jewelry, just an empty casket, buried in Catherine Flynn's grave. So we had Catherine Flynn's body in George Hartley's grave, Dr. Pritchard said, and an empty casket in Catherine Flynn's grave, and no idea where George Hartley was. The police investigation expanded. They examined the funeral home that had handled both burials in 1975. The funeral home was still in operation, now run by the third generation of the same family. They pulled their records from 1975, found entries for both George Hartley and Catherine Flynn. Both funerals handled within days of each other. Both burials at West Cemetery in Section D. The funeral director, who'd handled the burials, had died in 1998, Dr. Pritchard said. But his son, who'd assisted with the funerals, was still alive, now in his 70s. And he remembered those burials, remembered because they'd been on consecutive days. George on the 19th, Catherine on the 20th. And he remembered something else. The son, William Morrison, recalled that there had been confusion at the cemetery, plot numbers that weren't clearly marked. The cemetery had been doing renovations in Section D. New paths, new landscaping. Some plots had temporary markers. William remembered his father being frustrated with the cemetery staff. Remembered them double-checking plot assignments multiple times. But both burials were completed without incident, Dr. Pritchard said. Both families signed off on the services. Both burials were recorded properly. And for 41 years, nobody questioned anything. The police investigation looked for George Hartley's body, checked every burial at West Cemetery. In March 1975, checked neighboring cemeteries, checked hospital records, morgue records, funeral home records, found nothing. George Hartley's body had vanished. The theory is that George was placed in Catherine's casket, Dr. Pritchard said. That somehow, at the funeral home or during transport, the bodies were switched. George was prepared and placed in what should have been Catherine's casket. Catherine's body, which by rights should have been in her own casket, ended up in George's. And when they buried them, nobody realized. But that theory had problems. How could funeral home staff place the wrong body in a casket without noticing? How could families view the wrong body without recognizing the error? Unless neither body was viewed, Dr. Pritchard said. George had died at home, heart attack. His face was apparently affected. The family chose a closed casket, and Catherine, she died in hospital after prolonged illness to pneumonia. Her appearance was poor. Her only nephew, who arranged the funeral, also chose closed casket. Neither body was viewed by family after preparation. So the funeral home could have placed George in Catherine's casket and Catherine in George's casket, sealed both, and nobody would have known. The coffin plates would have been correct, attached to the casket lids, but the bodies inside would have been switched. But that still doesn't explain where George is now, Dr. Pritchard said. If George was in Catherine's casket, he should be in plot 249. But plot 249 is empty. Someone buried an empty casket, or someone moved George's body after the initial burial, or something else happened that nobody has been able to determine. The police investigation continued for 18 months. Interviewed everyone involved who was still alive. Examined every record, checked every grave in Section D, even used ground-penetrating radar to look for unmarked burials. Found nothing. George Hartley is missing, Dr. Pritchard said. His body was never found. We don't know where he is. Don't know what happened to him, and we probably never will. Catherine Flynn's remains were reburied. A new funeral was held. 41 years late, her nephew's family attended. Catherine was placed in a different plot with proper identification, finally laid to rest correctly. But George's grave, plot 247, remains empty, Dr. Pritchard said. The Hartley family decided not to use it, said it felt wrong, said they couldn't bury anyone there knowing George should be there but isn't, so it sits. Empty grave with George Hartley's headstone, memorializing a man whose body is somewhere unknown. The will Dennis Hartley claimed existed was never found. The inheritance dispute was settled by the courts without it. But the family was shattered by the revelation. Their father's grave didn't contain their father. They'd been visiting the wrong grave for 41 years, mourning at a place where a stranger was buried. Joan Hartley told me something that stayed with me, Dr. Pritchard said. She said, all those years, I'd talk to my father at his grave, tell him about my life, my children, everything, and he wasn't there. He wasn't listening. He was somewhere else, or nowhere, and I'll never know. Dr. Pritchard had kept all the documentation from the case, the photographs, the DNA results, the investigation reports. She'd used it in lectures on the importance of proper identification protocols, on the consequences of administrative errors, on how mistakes can persist for decades, because nobody checks. This case changed cemetery practices in Manchester. Dr. Pritchard said, all cemeteries in the region implemented new verification protocols, mandatory photographs of remains before casket sealing, mandatory confirmation of identity at graveside, better plot marking, better record keeping, all because of George Hartley. But those changes didn't help George, didn't find him, didn't give his family closure. The police investigation is technically still open, Dr. Pritchard said. Unsolved missing person case, but nobody's actively working it. Nobody expects to find answers after all this time. Dr. Pritchard stood up, walked to her bookshelf, pulled out a folder, opened it carefully. Inside were photographs. Catherine Flynn's skeleton in George Hartley's casket. The empty casket from plot 249. George Hartley's headstone over an empty grave. You want to know what I believe? Dr. Pritchard said. I believe this was a catastrophic series of errors. I believe bodies were switched at the funeral home. I believe cemetery staff buried caskets in wrong plots. I believe records were incorrect or falsified to cover mistakes. And I believe George Hartley's body is buried somewhere in West Cemetery under someone else's name. Someone whose family has no idea they're visiting the wrong grave. She closed the folder, put it back. But I can't prove that, Dr. Pritchard said. Can't identify which grave might contain George. Can't justify exhuming hundreds of graves on speculation. So George stays missing, his family stays without closure, and somewhere in West Cemetery, someone is buried where George Hartley should be. Dr. Helen Pritchard walked me to the door that afternoon, and I left thinking about George Hartley, about a man who died in 1975 and vanished, about a family that visited his grave for 41 years without knowing he wasn't there, about Catherine Flynn, buried for 4 decades under the wrong name, about an empty casket in her grave. The rational explanation is administrative error. Bodies switched, records incorrect, mistakes compounded over time. All true, all documented. But it doesn't answer the fundamental question, where is George Hartley? Maybe he's in West Cemetery, under another name. Maybe his body was mishandled, lost, buried improperly, somewhere that was never recorded. Maybe there was criminal activity, body disposal, fraud, something darker than mere administrative error. Maybe we'll never know. And that's what makes this case so disturbing. Not the switch itself that can be explained, but the missing body, the man who disappeared between death and burial, who was supposed to be in plot 247, but wasn't, who was supposed to be somewhere, but is nowhere anyone can find. George Hartley died in 1975, but he never arrived at his grave. And 49 years later, nobody knows where he is. His children grew old, visiting an empty grave. His wife died, believing she was buried near him. And somewhere in England, George Hartley rests. Under someone else's name, in someone else's plot, with someone else's family visiting him, mourning him, talking to him, never knowing he's not who the headstone says he is, never knowing that somewhere, another family is still looking, still wondering, still mourning a man they can't find. Because death is supposed to be final, burial is supposed to be certain, but sometimes people disappear. Even after they're dead, even after they're buried, they just disappear, and nobody knows how to find them. Dr. Miguel Vargas worked as a forensic pathologist in Guadalajara, Mexico for 17 years before the exhumation in July 2018 made him question whether air escaping from sealed coffins could sound like human breath, like human resignation, like the last sigh of someone who'd been waiting to be released. He'd heard gases escape from bodies and caskets hundreds of times, had documented the science, had explained it to grieving families and nervous colleagues, but he'd never heard a sound that made 4 grown men step back from a grave in fear. Never seen expressions on his crew's faces that told him they'd all heard something that shouldn't exist. Never watched everyone refuse to return the next day, choosing unemployment over spending another moment near the grave of Ernesto Morales. I met Dr. Vargas at a restaurant in Guadalajara's historic district in December 2024. He'd left forensic pathology 2 years earlier, now taught anatomy at the Universidad de Guadalajara. He'd been reluctant to discuss the case, said it had affected him more than any of the violent deaths he'd investigated. But he'd agreed to talk because he said silence about these experiences serves no one. We sat at an outdoor table where music and conversation from the plaza masked our words, and he told me about the day they opened Ernesto Morales's coffin and heard it sigh. Ernesto Morales died on April 3, 2017, Dr. Vargas said, his hands wrapped around a glass of water. He was 54 years old. Traffic accident. Motorcycle collision with a truck. Died at the scene. Multiple trauma. The family had him buried quickly, within 2 days. Catholic service. Burial at Panteón de Mezquitan. Ernesto had been a successful businessman in Guadalajara, owned a chain of restaurants. Married, 3 children, active in the community. His death had been sudden, tragic. His wife, Claudia, had been devastated. The funeral had been large, well attended. Everything had been proper and respectful. 14 months later, Claudia petitioned for exhumation, Dr. Vargas said. She'd remarried, wanted to relocate Ernesto's remains to a different cemetery, wanted him closer to his family's plot in his hometown of Zapopan. Standard relocation request. Nothing unusual. The exhumation was scheduled for July 10, 2018. Dr. Vargas would supervise as required by law. He'd brought a crew, 3 workers who regularly assisted with exhumations. Roberto, Luis, and Francisco. Experienced men who'd done this work dozens of times. We arrived at Panteón de Mezquitan at 7 a.m., Dr. Vargas said. July in Guadalajara, already hot. We were expecting a routine day. Excavate. Open the casket for identification, verification, reseal it, transport to Zapopan. 4 or 5 hours maximum. Ernesto's grave was in Section 12, standard ground burial. The cemetery crew had begun excavation at sunrise. By 8:30, they'd reached the burial vault. It was concrete, showing 14 months of ground contact, but intact. They'd pulled it up, opened it. The casket looked fine, Dr. Vargas said. Metal casket, bronze finish, some surface corrosion, but structurally sound. The seal appeared intact. Everything normal. Dr. Vargas had examined the seal. It was a pressure seal, designed to keep air and moisture out. After 14 months, some deterioration was expected, but the seal was still functional. He'd positioned his tools to break it open. I applied pressure to the seal breakpoint, Dr. Vargas said. It popped, that familiar sound when pressure equalizes. He stopped, looked down at his hands. Then we heard it. Not just the pop of the seal breaking, something else. A sound that came from inside the casket. Low, sustained, like air escaping. Yes, but shaped, formed, like breath. It sounded like a sigh, Dr. Vargas said quietly. Like someone exhaling their last breath. Long, slow, human. And we all heard it. All 4 of us. Roberto's eyes went wide. Luis crossed himself. Francisco stepped back from the casket. Dr. Vargas had frozen with his hands on the casket lid. The sound had lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then silence. Just the ambient noise of the cemetery, birds, distant traffic, wind in the trees. I told them it was just air, Dr. Vargas said. Explained that when caskets are sealed, gas buildup from decomposition can create pressure. When you break the seal, that pressure releases, makes sounds. Sometimes those sounds can seem almost human because they're passing through organic material. The body, the tissues, its physics, its chemistry. It's not supernatural. The crew had nodded, accepted his explanation. But Dr. Vargas had seen their faces, seen the fear that his words hadn't completely erased. They'd all heard something that their rational minds said was impossible, but their instincts recognized. I opened the casket, Dr. Vargas said, and I saw Ernesto's face. 14 months of decomposition had occurred. The body was in the expected state, significant tissue breakdown, saponification in areas, mummification in others. Not pleasant, but normal for the climate and burial conditions. But his expression, Dr. Vargas said. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes, the eyelids were partially open, shrunken back, and the expression on his face, what remained of it, looked like he'd been gasping, like his final moment was trying to get air. Dr. Vargas had seen thousands of dead bodies, knew that post-mortem changes could create any number of expressions. Jaw muscles relax, eyelids shrink, faces settle into positions that sometimes look peaceful, sometimes look agonized. It meant nothing, was just biology. But combined with that sound, Dr. Vargas said, combined with the sigh we'd heard, looking at Ernesto's face felt wrong. Felt like we were looking at someone who'd just died, who'd just exhaled their last breath the moment we opened the casket. Roberto had walked away, said he needed a moment. Luis was praying quietly. Francisco was staring at the casket, his face pale. I performed the identification verification, Dr. Vargas said. Examined the body, confirmed it was Ernesto Morales, based on dental records, based on the medical information I had. Everything was proper. Everything was correct. Just a normal exhumation of a man who died 14 months earlier. But the crew was rattled. Dr. Vargas had suggested a break, told them to step away, get water, calm down. They'd moved to the shade of a nearby mausoleum, and Dr. Vargas had stayed with the casket, examining it more carefully. I looked at the seal again, Dr. Vargas said. Checked the interior of the casket for any signs of disturbance, any evidence that Ernesto had been alive when buried, any scratch marks, any damage, anything that would indicate consciousness after burial. He'd found nothing. The casket interior was undamaged. The satin lining was intact. Ernesto's positioning was normal, hands folded, body straight, exactly as he would have been placed at burial. No signs of movement, no signs of struggle. The sound had been gas release, Dr. Vargas said. Had to be. But I'd broken seals on hundreds of caskets. I'd heard gas escape dozens of times, and I'd never heard anything like that. Never heard something so sustained, so shaped, so much like a human exhalation. Dr. Vargas had called the crew back. They'd resealed the casket, prepared it for transport, loaded it into the funeral vehicle. The work was done mechanically, silently. Nobody spoke, nobody made eye contact. We transported Ernesto to the cemetery in Zapopan, Dr. Vargas said. Supervised his reburial, finished the job. By 2 p.m., it was complete. I dismissed the crew, told them the next exhumation was scheduled for the following morning at 9 a.m. None of them showed up. Dr. Vargas had called Roberto at 8 the next morning, asked where the crew was. Roberto told me they weren't coming back, Dr. Vargas said. Said they'd discussed it. Said what happened yesterday had scared them too much. They were done with exhumation work. Roberto told me, Doctor, that sound, that wasn't air. That was him. That was Senor Morales. He was in there, waiting, and when you opened the casket, he could finally leave. And we're not going to be there the next time that happens to someone else. Dr. Vargas had tried to reason with him, explained the science again, offered higher pay, but Roberto was firm. The whole crew was quitting. They'd find other work. I ended up having to hire a completely new crew, Dr. Vargas said. Lost 3 experienced workers because of one sound. One moment, one exhumation that should have been routine. Dr. Vargas had written up the case in his report, documented everything, including the sound. He described it clinically. Upon breaking the casket seal, escaping gases created an audible exhalation-like sound, lasting approximately 3 seconds. Phenomenon consistent with pressure release in sealed caskets containing decomposing remains. But that's not what it sounded like, Dr. Vargas said. That's the scientific explanation. That's what I tell myself, what I teach my students. But when I was there, when I heard it, it sounded like a sigh, like someone had been holding their breath for 14 months, and they finally could let go. Dr. Vargas had researched the phenomenon afterward, found scientific literature on gas release from sealed caskets, found explanations of how pressure builds, how decomposition creates gases, how those gases can make sounds when released. All the science was there, all the rational explanations. But I also found other reports. Dr. Vargas said, anecdotal accounts from other forensic pathologists, other coroners, stories about sounds from caskets, sounds that seemed too human, too deliberate, sounds that made experienced professionals uncomfortable. Most didn't publish these accounts. Most kept them private, shared them quietly with colleagues, because admitting that you heard something that scared you, something you couldn't quite explain despite your scientific training, that made you seem weak, made you seem unfit for the work. But I'm telling you now, Dr. Vargas said, I heard something that day, something that made sense scientifically, but felt wrong emotionally, and I wasn't the only one. 3 experienced workers heard it too, and they quit rather than risk hearing it again. Dr. Vargas had continued doing exhumations for 2 more years after the Morales case. Heard gas escape from caskets many times. Sometimes it hissed, sometimes it hissed, sometimes it popped, sometimes it made low whistling sounds. But he never heard anything like that sigh again, never heard anything that made him step back from a casket. I think about Ernesto Morales sometimes, Dr. Vargas said. About his expression, about that sound, and I wonder what if some part of consciousness does linger. What if when you die suddenly, violently, unexpectedly, some part of you stays with your body, trapped, waiting, and when someone finally opens the casket, that energy is released, exhales, leaves. It wasn't scientific. Dr. Vargas knew that, but standing at that grave, hearing that sound, seeing that expression, it had felt like witnessing a departure, like Ernesto Morales had been waiting in that sealed casket for 14 months. And when Dr. Vargas broke the seal, when air could flow again, when the barrier was removed, Ernesto could finally leave. The Catholic Church has a tradition, Dr. Vargas said, of praying for the souls of the dead, of believing that the deceased need our prayers to move on, to transition. I'm not particularly religious, but after Ernesto Morales, I started saying a prayer every time I opened a casket, just quietly, just to myself, saying, you can leave now, you can go, you're free. He'd never told his colleagues, never mentioned it in his reports, just did it silently. Because it made him feel better, made the work feel less like violation, and more like service, like he was helping, like he was releasing people who'd been waiting. I left forensic pathology in 2022, Dr. Vargas said, not because of Ernesto Morales specifically, but cases like his, they accumulate, they weigh on you, make you question what death is, what consciousness is, whether we understand anything at all about the transition from life to whatever comes next. Now he taught anatomy, worked with cadavers that had been donated to science, bodies that had been prepared, preserved, that bore no resemblance to the recently deceased. Bodies that were educational tools, not people. It was easier, cleaner, less complicated. But I remember every exhumation, Dr. Vargas said. Every casket I opened, every face I saw. And I remember Ernesto Morales, most of all, because of that sound. That impossible, all-too-human sound. Dr. Miguel Vargas paid for our meal, and we walked out into the Guadalajara evening. The plaza was full of life, music, laughter, people living their normal lives. And I thought about Ernesto Morales, about a man who died instantly in a motorcycle accident, but whose casket sighed when opened 14 months later. About 3 experienced workers who quit, rather than hear that sound again. About a forensic pathologist who started praying to corpses because one of them had seemed to respond. The rational explanation is simple. Gas buildup, pressure release. Sound shaped by organic material, physics, and chemistry, creating an audible phenomenon that coincidentally resembled human breath. Science can explain it. Science does explain it. But Dr. Vargas heard it, and it made him step back. Made 3 men quit their jobs. Made a scientist start praying. Maybe that's what matters more than the explanation, not whether it was actually Ernesto's consciousness leaving his body, but that it sounded enough like it to make people react with instinctive certainty that they'd witnessed something beyond normal experience. Maybe death isn't always instant. Maybe some part of us lingers with our bodies. Maybe when caskets are sealed, when we're buried, when we're locked away from air and light, that part of us waits. Waits for the seal to break. Waits for the lid to open. Waits for the moment when it can finally exhale. Finally sigh. Finally leave. And maybe, just maybe, Dr. Vargas's prayers help. Help whatever's waiting know it's time. Help whatever's lingering understand it can go. Help whatever's trapped in the sealed darkness finally find its way out. Because that sound, that too human sigh, that moment when 4 men froze because they all heard the same impossible thing, that was real. That happened. And it doesn't matter whether the explanation is gases or ghosts or consciousness. What matters is that Ernesto Morales' casket sighed. And after 14 months in the dark, he could finally breathe again. One last time. Raymond Cole worked at Riverside Funeral Home in Fort Myers, Florida for 19 years before Hurricane Irma in September 2017 showed him that some mysteries can't be explained by floodwater and physics. He'd dealt with storm damage before, had helped recover caskets displaced by flooding, had seen what hurricanes could do to cemeteries. But he'd never seen what he saw in the Whitfield vault, a body that shouldn't have moved, shouldn't have turned, shouldn't have left scratch marks inside a casket that had been sealed tight and showed no signs of being opened. Raymond still works at Riverside, but he doesn't talk about the Whitfield case, not officially, not where the family might hear. But he told me, because some things need to be documented, even when they can't be explained. I met Raymond at a waterfront restaurant in Fort Myers Beach in October 2024. He'd agreed to meet after his shift, said he preferred talking about this outside the funeral home, away from where the work happens. He was a solid man in his early 50s, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades around death. But his hands gripped his water glass too tight as he talked. Hurricane Irma hit southwest Florida, September 10, 2017, Raymond said. Category 4, storm surge, flooding, wind damage. The whole area was devastated. Our funeral home lost power for a week, but the real problems came later, when we started assessing cemetery damage. Riverside Funeral Home managed 3 cemeteries in Lee County. All 3 had experienced flooding. Storm surge from the Caloosahatchee River had inundated low-lying areas. Some caskets had surfaced. Some vaults had shifted. It was a disaster, and Raymond's job was helping coordinate the recovery and reburial efforts. Oakwood Cemetery was the worst affected, Raymond said. It's right near the river. Older cemetery, some graves dating back to the 1800s. The floodwaters sat there for 3 days before receding. When we finally got in to assess, we found 17 displaced caskets. Some had floated up completely. Others had shifted inside their vaults. The recovery process was methodical. Document everything. Photograph everything. Identify remains. Contact families. arrange for proper reburial. Raymond had done this work after Hurricane Charlie in 2004, knew the protocols, knew how to handle it respectfully. The Whitfield Vault was in Section C, Raymond said. Higher ground, didn't flood as badly as other areas, but there'd been water intrusion. We could see it. The vault had shifted slightly. Protocol required us to open it, inspect the casket, make sure everything was secure before resealing. The Whitfield Vault contained one burial. Douglas Whitfield died June 23, 2017, age 67. Heart attack. Raymond had handled the funeral personally, had prepared Douglas, had coordinated the service, had supervised the burial. It had been less than 3 months earlier. The body would still be relatively intact. September 28, 2017, Raymond said. That's when we opened the Whitfield Vault. 3 weeks after the hurricane, the water had receded. The cemetery was accessible again. I was there with 2 other funeral home staff, Marcus Perry and Lynn Rodriguez, and we had a cemetery contractor doing the excavation work. They'd pulled the vault up using standard equipment. The concrete was intact, but water-stained. They'd opened it carefully. Inside was the casket, 18-gauge steel sealed bronze finish, the kind designed to be water-resistant. And it looked fine, no visible damage, no corrosion. The seal appeared intact. But the casket had moved inside the vault. Raymond said it was at an angle, shifted to one side. That can happen with flooding. Water gets in, creates buoyancy, things shift. It's physics. We expected that. They'd photographed the casket in position, then lifted it out for closer inspection, set it on the grass beside the vault. Raymond had examined the seal. It looked intact. No visible breaks, no signs of tampering or water intrusion. I told Marcus and Lynn we should open it. Raymond said, check the interior condition. Make sure Douglas's remains were still properly positioned. Make sure we didn't need to do any restoration work before resealing everything. Raymond had the key to break the seal. It was a specific tool funeral directors use, designed to crack the seal without damaging the casket. He'd positioned it, applied pressure. The seal broke with that familiar pop. Then he'd lifted the lid, and I knew immediately something was wrong. Raymond said quietly. The positioning was wrong. Everything was wrong. Raymond had placed Douglas Whitfield on his back, standard positioning, hands folded on his abdomen, face up, wearing his suit, looking peaceful. That's how Douglas had been when they'd sealed the casket in June. That's how he should have looked in September. But Douglas was face down, Raymond said, completely face down. His body had turned over. His face was pressed against the casket pillow. His arms were underneath him, and his legs, his knees were bent, like he'd been trying to push himself up. Marcus had stepped back, said something in Spanish that Raymond didn't catch. Lynn had put her hand over her mouth. The cemetery contractor had started making phone calls, and Raymond had just stood there, staring at Douglas Whitfield's body in an impossible position. I tried to rationalize it, Raymond said. Told myself maybe the flooding had caused it. Maybe water had gotten in somehow, created buoyancy, caused the body to shift. But the casket interior was dry, completely dry. No water, no moisture. The seal had been intact. Raymond had examined the body more closely. The suit Douglas was wearing showed no signs of water damage. The casket lining, the white crepe interior, was pristine, dry. If water had gotten in, if flooding had caused the body to move, there would be evidence. But there wasn't. Then Lynn pointed at the casket lid. Raymond said, at the interior, and that's when we saw them. Scratch marks. The marks were faint but visible. 4 parallel lines, multiple sets, concentrated near where the head would be if Douglas were lying face up in his original position. The white crepe lining was torn in places, and underneath, on the metal itself, were scratches, superficial but real. I looked at Douglas's hands, Raymond said. They were underneath him, bent at awkward angles, but I could see the fingernails. They were intact, clean, no damage, no signs of scratching, no fabric or metal fragments, nothing that would indicate he'd made those marks. Raymond had called his supervisor immediately, explained the situation. The supervisor had arrived within 30 minutes with the funeral home owner. They'd examined everything, photographed everything, and they'd called the medical examiner. Dr. Sandra Lopez arrived around 2 p.m., so Raymond said. She examined the body in situ, checked for signs of trauma, checked the fingernails, checked everything, and she couldn't explain it. Dr. Lopez had documented the body position, had noted the scratch marks, had examined the seal integrity, and her conclusion was that this was unexplained post-burial body displacement with no clear mechanism. She ruled out foul play, Raymond said. The vault had been sealed. The casket seal had been intact until we broke it. No evidence anyone had opened it after burial. No signs of tampering. So how did Douglas end up face down? How did those scratch marks get there? They'd called the Whitfield family. Douglas's widow, Susan, had come to the cemetery. Raymond had explained the situation as carefully as he could, told her they'd found the casket displaced by flooding and that Douglas's body had shifted. Didn't mention face down. Didn't mention scratch marks. Just said they needed to do repositioning and restoration before reburial. Susan asked to see him. Raymond said, I tried to discourage it, told her the body had been disturbed, that it might be upsetting, but she insisted. So I let her look, and when she saw Douglas face down, she gasped, started crying, said he was claustrophobic, he was terrified of being buried. I shouldn't have done closed casket. I should have cremated him like he wanted. That was the first Raymond had heard about claustrophobia, about Douglas's fear of being buried. Susan explained that Douglas had panic attacks in enclosed spaces, had made her promise, years earlier, that when he died, he'd be cremated. But when the time came, Susan couldn't do it. Her faith didn't approve of cremation. She'd chosen burial instead, had chosen a sealed casket, had done exactly what Douglas feared most. Susan looked at those scratch marks. Raymond said. And she said, he woke up. He tried to get out. Oh my God. He woke up, and I'd buried him. Raymond and Dr. Lopez had both assured her that wasn't possible, that Douglas had been pronounced dead at the hospital, that Raymond himself had prepared the body, had verified death through standard funeral home procedures, that modern medicine didn't make those mistakes, that it was physically impossible for Douglas to have been alive. But Susan wouldn't accept it, Raymond said. She kept saying, then how did he turn over? How did those marks get there? And we didn't have answers. We still don't. Dr. Lopez had performed a limited examination, confirmed that Douglas's condition was consistent with being deceased for 3 months. Advanced decomposition, no signs of recent trauma. The positioning was impossible, but the body itself showed Douglas had been dead since June. We repositioned him, Raymond said. Carefully, respectfully. Put him back the way he should have been. Face up, hands folded. We replaced the torn lining where the scratch marks were, made everything look proper again. Then we resealed the casket and reburied him. But Raymond couldn't let it go. He'd researched everything he could find about post-mortem body movement, found cases of coffin birth, where decomposition gases cause movement, found documentation of bodies shifting due to muscle relaxation or gas buildup. But nothing explained a complete body rotation. Nothing explained scratch marks, when the fingernails showed no damage. I talked to other funeral directors, Raymond said, older guys with decades of experience. Asked if they'd ever seen anything like it. Most said no, but one director man, who'd been in the business for 50 years, he told me a story. The director had worked in New Orleans in the 1970s, had opened a vault after flooding from a tropical storm. Found a body that had turned sideways in the casket. The man had been claustrophobic in life, terrified of burial. His family had insisted on it anyway. And when they opened the casket after the flood, he'd shifted, turned, like he'd been trying to find a way out. The old director said some bodies remember. Raymond said, remember what the person feared. Remember what they fought against, and under certain conditions, flooding, storms, disturbances, that fear manifests physically. The body moves in ways it shouldn't, tries to escape even though the person is long dead. Raymond didn't know if he believed that. Didn't know if he believed bodies could carry consciousness, could remember fear, could move with intention, but he couldn't explain the Whitfield case any other way. I've opened hundreds of caskets, Raymond said. After floods, after vault failures, after family requests, and I've never seen anything else like Douglas Whitfield. Bodies shift, sure, settle, move slightly, but complete rotation, face down, with scratch marks. That doesn't happen naturally. Raymond had kept copies of the photographs, against protocol, but he'd done it anyway. He'd shown them to me on his phone. Douglas face down in the casket. The scratch marks on the lid interior, the bent knees, the positioned arms underneath the body. Susan Whitfield had Douglas disinterred and cremated 6 months later, Raymond said. Said she couldn't leave him buried. Couldn't stop thinking about him face down, about those scratch marks, about his claustrophobia. She had him cremated and scattered his ashes in the Gulf, said that's what he'd wanted. What she should have done in the first place. Raymond had handled that disinterment too, had opened the casket one final time. Douglas was still face up, the way they'd repositioned him, peaceful. But Raymond couldn't shake the memory of how they'd found him the first time. Turned over, face pressed into the pillow, knees bent. You want to know what I believe? Raymond said. I believe Douglas Whitfield's fear didn't end with his death. I believe his claustrophobia, his terror of being buried, was so intense that some part of it persisted. And when the hurricane flooded the cemetery, when conditions changed, when everything was disrupted, that fear acted. The body moved, tried to turn, tried to escape. He put his phone away. Outside, the Florida sunset painted the sky orange and pink. Tourists walked past. Normal people with normal concerns. The scratch marks are what I can't explain, Raymond said. If it was just gas buildup, just decomposition causing movement, there wouldn't be scratch marks. Those marks were deliberate, repeated. Someone, something, clawed at that lid. But Douglas's fingernails were clean, undamaged. So what made those marks? Raymond stood up, preparing to leave for his evening shift. More funerals to coordinate, more families to comfort, more bodies to prepare with the care and respect they deserved. I still prepare claustrophobic people for burial, Raymond said. Family requests it, and I do my job. But now I always tell families about cremation. Tell them it's an option. Tell them that if their loved one had any fears about burial, any anxieties about being underground, maybe cremation is better. Because I don't know what happened to Douglas Whitfield, but I know he ended up face down in a sealed casket with scratch marks on the lid. And that's not natural. That's not explainable, and I never want to see it again. Raymond Cole walked back to his car, heading to Riverside Funeral Home for another night of serving the dead and comforting the living. And I sat there thinking about Douglas Whitfield, about a man with claustrophobia buried against his wishes, about a body found face down after a hurricane, about scratch marks that shouldn't exist. The rational explanation is physics and decomposition, gas buildup, causing movement, flooding, creating conditions that shifted the body, scratch marks from something other than human nails, debris, metal fragments, something that got into the casket somehow, despite the intact seal. But Raymond saw that body, saw the positioning, saw scratch marks that appeared deliberate, repeated, desperate. Maybe Douglas Whitfield's fear was so intense it survived death. Maybe claustrophobia doesn't end when your heart stops. Maybe when you bury someone who's terrified of being buried, some part of them never stops trying to get out. And maybe, during a hurricane, during flooding, during chaos, when the normal rules of physics are disrupted, that terror finds a way to manifest, finds a way to turn the body, finds a way to scratch at the lid, finds a way to show us what we should have known. That death doesn't conquer fear. Sometimes, fear survives, and the body remembers, even when it shouldn't be able to move, even when the casket is sealed, even when every rational explanation says it's impossible. The body remembers, and tries to escape, one last time. Margaret Chen worked as a funeral director in San Francisco, California for 28 years before the exhumation in August 1994 showed her that some grief carries truths we're not supposed to find. She'd relocated remains before, had opened countless caskets containing infants and children, had handled the delicate work of moving tiny bodies with the reverence they deserved. But she'd never opened a casket and found it empty. Never seen burial records that documented a body that wasn't there. Never watched an elderly mother weep and say words that explained nothing and everything. Margaret retired in 2010, moved to a quiet neighborhood in Oakland. But she's never forgotten the Campbell twins. Never stopped wondering what really happened in 1957. Never stopped thinking about that empty casket. I met Margaret at her home in Oakland in November 2024. She'd agreed to talk after I'd spent months tracking down people involved in the case. She was 78 now, her hands showing the tremor of age, but her memory was sharp. She served tea and we sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of the hundreds of families she'd served. And she told me about the day they opened the caskets of Rose and Lily Campbell. The Campbell family contacted me in July 1994, Margaret said, holding her teacup with both hands. Their mother, Dorothy Campbell, was dying, cancer. She had weeks, maybe a month, and she'd made a request. She wanted her twin daughters, who died at birth in 1957, exhumed and reburied in the family plot at Cypress Lawn Cemetery. Wanted them beside her and her late husband. Wanted the family together. Dorothy Campbell was 81 years old. She'd been 23 when she gave birth to twins in July 1957. Both girls had been stillborn, delivered at 32 weeks, a tragedy that had haunted Dorothy her entire life. She'd named them Rose and Lily, had buried them at Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, had visited their graves every year for 37 years. Dorothy's son, Robert, handled the arrangements. Margaret said he was in his 50s, Dorothy's only surviving child. He explained his mother's situation, her last wishes. Said the twins had been buried in simple caskets, side by side at Holy Cross. He had the burial records, the plot numbers. Everything was documented. Margaret had coordinated hundreds of disinterments. The process was straightforward. Get court approval, file the proper permits, contact both cemeteries, arrange transportation for infant remains. After 37 years, she expected very little, possibly some bones, possibly nothing. Infant caskets from the 1950s weren't built to last. The bodies would have decomposed completely. August 16, 1994, Margaret said, that's when we did the disinterment. Early morning before the cemetery opened to visitors. I was there with Robert Campbell, his wife, and Dorothy. Despite her condition, she'd insisted on being present. She wanted to see her daughters one last time. The crew at Holy Cross had located the graves using the plot records, side by side, just as documented. Two small markers, simple granite. Rose Campbell, July 12, 1957, and Lily Campbell, July 12, 1957. The graves were in the infant section, surrounded by dozens of other tiny markers. We excavated carefully, Margaret said. Infant caskets are small, fragile. We pulled up the first one, Rose's casket, according to the burial map. It was in poor condition. The wood had deteriorated badly, but it was intact enough to recognize as a casket. We set it carefully on the grass. Then they'd excavated the second plot, Lily's grave. The casket came up in similar condition, weathered, deteriorating, but intact. Both caskets were transported to Margaret's funeral home for opening and examination before transport to Cypress Lawn. "We opened them in our preparation room," Margaret said. "Private, just Robert and me. Dorothy was too frail to be present for this part. We document what we found, then allow the family to pay respects before reburial." Margaret had opened Rose's casket first. Inside was what she'd expected. Infant remains, bones mostly. The tiny skeleton was largely intact. The burial gown had deteriorated, but was still partially present. There was also a small blanket, a silver nameplate that read Rose, and a crucifix. Everything consistent with a 1957 infant burial. "Then we opened Lily's casket," Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Not empty of everything. The nameplate was there, Lily engraved in silver. A blanket was there, folded neatly, but no body, no bones, no remains of any kind. Just an empty casket with the blanket and nameplate." "I stood there staring," Margaret said. Robert was beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then Robert said, "Where is she? Where's my sister?" Margaret had examined the casket carefully, looked for any signs of disturbance. The casket had been sealed, not with modern seals, but with the methods used in the 1950s. The seal showed no signs of being broken and resealed. The wood deterioration was consistent throughout. There was no evidence the casket had been opened since burial. "I checked the nameplate 3 times," Margaret said. "Made sure we had the right casket. Lily Campbell, July 12, 1957. This was definitely the casket that had been buried in Lily's plot, but there was no body inside." Margaret had called the cemetery immediately. Explained the situation. The cemetery superintendent had arrived within an hour. He'd brought the original burial records. Both showed clear documentation. Rose Campbell and Lily Campbell, buried July 15, 1957, side by side. Plot numbers matched. Everything matched, except one casket was empty. The superintendent was defensive, Margaret said. Said this was impossible. Said both infants had been buried properly. Said there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Rose's remains were in her casket. Lily's casket was empty. They'd re-examined Lily's gravesite, checked the surrounding ground, looked for any signs of previous disturbance or exhumation. Nothing. The graves had been undisturbed since 1957. The cemetery records showed no notations about any issues, no documentation of any problems. Robert insisted we tell his mother, Margaret said. I tried to discourage it. Dorothy was dying. Why burden her with this mystery? But Robert said she had a right to know, so we told her. Dorothy Campbell had been in bed at home, too weak to move. Margaret and Robert had gone to her house, sat beside her bed, explained what they'd found. Rose's remains were there. Lily's casket was empty. Dorothy didn't look surprised, Margaret said. She just started crying, quiet tears, and she said, I always felt one of them was still alive, always. But they told me both babies were born dead. They told me there was nothing they could do. Robert had tried to comfort his mother, told her it must be some mistake, some administrative error. But Dorothy shook her head. She wanted to tell them something. Something she'd never told anyone. Something about the twins' birth. Dorothy said the delivery had been complicated. Margaret said she'd been at St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. It was 1957. Different medical practices, different protocols. The babies had been premature. She'd heard one cry. She was certain. She'd heard one of the twins cry. But the doctor had told her. Both were stillborn. Had told her husband, James, the same thing. Both babies dead. Nothing could be done. Dorothy had been sedated after the delivery. Standard practice in 1957. She'd been unconscious for hours. When she woke up, James told her the babies had been taken care of. arrangements made. She'd never seen either infant, never held them. The hospital's policy was that stillborn babies weren't shown to mothers, thought it was too traumatic. Dorothy said she'd asked James if he was sure they were both dead. Margaret said. Asked if he'd seen them. James said yes. The doctor had shown him. Both babies had been stillborn. But Dorothy never believed it. Said she'd heard that cry. Knew one baby had been alive. But everyone told her she was wrong. Told her she'd been confused, medicated, grief-stricken. Eventually she stopped arguing, but she never stopped believing. Robert had been stunned. His father James had died in 1982. Couldn't be asked about this now. The hospital records from 1957 were likely destroyed or inaccessible. There was no way to verify what had actually happened. But Margaret had an idea. Margaret said, speaking of herself in third person, the way she'd done throughout the story, when things got difficult. She suggested they contact St. Mary's Hospital, see if any records remained, see if there was any documentation of the birth. Robert had made calls. St. Mary's Hospital still existed, but had been through multiple renovations and ownership changes. Their records department searched, found nothing from 1957. Too old, too much time had passed. The records had been destroyed decades ago according to retention policies. Then Robert found something else. Margaret said. He'd been going through his father's belongings, things stored in the attic, and he found a letter, dated August 1957, 1 month after the twins were born, addressed to James Campbell from St. Mary's Hospital. The letter was brief, formal. It thanked James for his understanding regarding the difficult situation and confirmed that arrangements had been made as discussed. It was signed by the hospital administrator and a doctor whose signature was illegible. Robert showed me that letter, Margaret said, and I felt cold reading it. Arrangements had been made as discussed. What arrangements? What difficult situation? That letter suggested something had been agreed to. Something beyond just burial of stillborn infants. Margaret had researched 1957 adoption practices, found that in that era, particularly for premature or ill infants, hospitals sometimes facilitated private adoptions, sometimes without full disclosure to birth parents, especially if the parents were young, unmarried, or considered unable to care for a sick child. It was illegal, but it happened. Dorothy Campbell had been 23, Margaret said. James had been 25, working class, Catholic. They already had a 1-year-old son. When the twins came early, when one was healthy enough to survive, and one wasn't, maybe the hospital made a decision. Maybe they told James one baby could survive, but would need extensive care. Maybe they suggested adoption. Maybe James agreed, thinking it was best. Maybe they told Dorothy both were dead to make it easier. It was speculation. Unprovable, but it explained the empty casket. Explained Dorothy's insistence that she'd heard a cry. Explained that letter about arrangements. Robert tried to investigate, Margaret said. Contacted adoption agencies. Tried to find records. But 1957 adoptions, especially private or hospital-facilitated ones, were often sealed or poorly documented. Without knowing which baby survived, Rose or Lily, without knowing which family adopted her, there was no way to search. Dorothy Campbell died 3 weeks after the exhumation. Robert had Rose's remains reburied at Cypress Lawn beside where Dorothy would soon be buried. Lily's empty casket was buried there too. All the family together except for the one who might still be alive somewhere. I attended Dorothy's funeral, Margaret said. She'd requested I coordinate it. And at the service, Robert spoke about his mother's grief, about the twins she'd lost, about how she'd visited their graves every year for 37 years, about how she'd always felt one of them was still alive. And he said, "If Lily is out there somewhere, if she's alive, I hope she had a good life. I hope she was loved. I hope someday we'll meet." Margaret had kept copies of the documentation, the burial records showing both twins interred, the exhumation permits. The photographs of Rose's remains and Lily's empty casket, she'd filed everything carefully. Knew this was an unusual case, knew it might need to be referenced someday. Over the years, I've wondered, Margaret said. Wondered if Lily Campbell is alive. She'd be 67 now. Probably doesn't know she's adopted. Probably thinks her birth date is different. Probably has no idea she had a twin sister. Has no idea her birth mother visited an empty grave for 37 years. Margaret had researched similar cases. Found documentation of other hospital-facilitated adoptions in the 1950s and 1960s. Found cases where parents were told their babies died when actually they'd been adopted out. It wasn't common, but it happened, especially with premature twins where one was healthy and one wasn't. The ethical violations are enormous, Margaret said. Lying to parents, falsifying death certificates, burying empty caskets. But in 1957, hospitals had enormous power. Parents trusted doctors absolutely. If a doctor said your baby was dead, you believed it. You didn't demand to see the body. You didn't question. Margaret had contacted Robert several times over the years. He'd done DNA testing, uploaded his profile to ancestry databases, hoped that maybe Lily would do the same. Maybe she'd get curious about her heritage. Maybe she'd search for biological family. But so far nothing, no matches, no contact. Robert is 71 now, Margaret said. Still hoping, still wondering if his sister is out there. But time is running out. If Lily is alive, if she's going to learn the truth, it needs to happen soon. Margaret stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a folder. Inside were the photographs from the exhumation. Rose's tiny skeleton, Lily's empty casket with its nameplate and folded blanket. The documentation proving both babies had supposedly been buried. I've kept these for 30 years, Margaret said, waiting for someone to ask. Waiting for Lily to come looking, because if she ever does, if she ever finds out she was adopted and starts searching for her birth family, she needs to know her mother never forgot her, never stopped visiting her grave, never stopped believing she was alive. Margaret closed the folder, put it back carefully. You want to know what I believe? Margaret said. I believe Dorothy Campbell was right. I believe she heard that cry. I believe one twin survived. I believe James made an impossible decision. Agreed to let the healthy baby be adopted, knowing he couldn't afford the medical care she'd need, knowing it was best for her. And I believe Dorothy never forgave him for it, even though she never knew for sure. She walked me to the door. Outside, Oakland's afternoon sun was warm. Normal life continuing. People who had no idea what secrets were buried in cemeteries. Empty caskets aren't supposed to exist, Margaret said. When we bury someone, there should be a body. But I've learned that sometimes the absence is the evidence. Sometimes what's missing tells the story more clearly than what's there. Margaret Chen closed the door, and I walked to my car, thinking about Rose and Lily Campbell, about twin sisters. One buried in a casket with her tiny bones, one who was never there at all, one who might still be alive, 67 years old, with no idea she had a twin who died, and a mother who mourned them both. The rational explanation is administrative error, records mixed up, a casket buried in the wrong plot, documentation mistakes from 1957 that can't be verified now. But Margaret saw that letter, saw those words. Arrangements had been made as discussed, and she saw Dorothy's face when she heard about the empty casket. Saw recognition, not surprise. Saw confirmation, not shock. Maybe Lily Campbell is alive. Maybe she was adopted by a family who gave her a good life. Maybe she's a grandmother now. Has no idea about her origins, has never wondered why she doesn't look like her parents. Maybe she'll never know. Or maybe, someday, she'll submit her DNA to an ancestry site, and she'll get a match to Robert Campbell, and she'll learn that she had a twin sister named Rose, and a mother named Dorothy, who visited an empty grave for 37 years, who always knew, who always believed, who was right all along. Because mothers know, even when everyone tells them they're wrong, even when the doctors and the death certificates and the burial records all say otherwise. Mothers know, and Dorothy Campbell knew she'd heard that cry, knew one of her babies was alive. Spent 37 years visiting a grave that held a casket with just a blanket and a nameplate, waiting for the truth to come out. And it did. 37 years too late for Dorothy. But maybe not too late for Lily. If she's still out there, if she ever finds out, if she ever comes looking for the family she never knew she had. Because empty caskets tell stories too. They just tell them in silence.
Harold Gutierrez worked as a funeral director in Houston, Texas, for 42 years before he retired in 2015. He handled thousands of services, saw every kind of death, comforted families through unimaginable grief. But there's one case he won't forget, one exhumation in 1978 that changed how he approached every preparation, every viewing, every burial, the case of Rebecca Valdez. The woman who wasn't dead when they buried her. I met Harold at his home in Pearland in July 2024. He'd been reluctant to talk about this case for decades, but now, at 79 years old, he said he wanted the story documented. Wanted people to understand why modern death verification procedures exist, why funeral directors are trained to look for specific signs, why the protocols matter. We sat in his living room surrounded by family photos and certificates from his career, and he told me about the day they opened Rebecca Valdez's casket. It was August 1978. Harold said, his hands folded in his lap. Rebecca Valdez had died, or so everyone thought, on June 3rd of that year. She was 53 years old, housewife, mother of 4. She'd collapsed at home. Her husband called an ambulance. By the time they got to the hospital, the doctors pronounced her dead. Natural causes, they said, heart failure. Rebecca's funeral had been standard. Viewing at the funeral home, service at the church, burial at Forest Park Cemetery. Harold had handled the arrangements personally. He'd prepared the body, dressed her, applied makeup, positioned her in the casket. She looked peaceful, Harold said quietly. That's what everyone said. Like she was sleeping. The family was devastated, but they took comfort in that. She looked at peace. Rebecca was buried on June 6, 1978, 3 days after her death. Standard time frame. The funeral went smoothly. The family said their goodbyes. The casket was sealed and lowered into the ground. Then, 2 months later, I got a call from a lawyer. Harold said. Rebecca had a life insurance policy, a big one, $500,000, and the insurance company was contesting the claim. They wanted an exhumation, wanted an autopsy. They thought maybe Rebecca had died from something other than natural causes. Thought maybe there was fraud involved. The family had objected, didn't want Rebecca disturbed. But the insurance company had legal grounds. A judge approved the exhumation order. Harold had been contacted to coordinate the process, supervise the disinterment, transport the casket, be present when it was opened. August 22nd, 1978, Harold said. I'll never forget that date. We arrived at the cemetery at 7 a.m. It was already hot. Texas summer. The ground crew had started digging at 6. By 8, they'd reached the vault. Harold had been there with the cemetery superintendent, 2 police officers, a medical examiner named Dr. Philip Martinez, and the lawyer representing the insurance company. Standard witnesses for an exhumation. We pulled the vault up, Harold said, opened it. The casket looked fine from the outside. No damage, no water intrusion. Everything sealed properly, but Dr. Martinez wanted to open it right there, at the graveside. Insurance company insisted. They wanted photographs, documentation, wanted to verify the body was Rebecca's before transporting it to the morgue. Harold had broken the casket seal, the same seal he'd secured 2.5 months earlier. He'd worked slowly, carefully. This was someone's mother, someone's wife. She deserved dignity, even in this process. I lifted the lid, Harold said, and I knew immediately something was wrong. The smell was the first indicator. Not the smell of normal decomposition, which Harold had experienced countless times. This was different, more pungent, more wrong. The casket interior looked disturbed. The satin lining was torn in places, wrinkled, bunched up. Then I saw Rebecca, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. And she wasn't the way I'd positioned her. Not at all. Harold had placed Rebecca on her back, hands folded over her abdomen, legs straight. Standard positioning. But the body in the casket was twisted. Her right knee was bent upward. Her left arm was across her chest. Her right hand was near her face, and her face. Her face was turned to the side, mouth open, eyes partially open. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, Harold said. Looked at the body, looked at the casket interior, and his face went white. He said, "Everyone needs to see this. Document everything, photograph everything." The police photographer had moved in, started taking pictures from every angle, and that's when they all saw it clearly. The inside of the casket lid. The white satin lining was shredded, torn, and underneath, on the wood itself, were marks, deep gouges, scratches, 4 parallel lines, again and again, all over the interior of the lid. I started shaking, Harold said. I'd prepared bodies for 20 years at that point. I knew what those marks meant. I knew what had happened. But I didn't want to believe it. Dr. Martinez had examined the body more closely right there at the graveside, looked at the hands, the fingers, the fingernails. Several nails were torn, broken, ragged, and there were splitters, tiny fragments of wood and satin fibers embedded in what remained of the tissue on the fingertips. Dr. Martinez said it out loud. Harold said what we were all thinking. She was alive. When you buried her, she was alive. She woke up in this coffin and tried to get out. Harold had stepped back from the grave. The morning heat suddenly felt suffocating. The police officers were talking urgently into their radios. The lawyer was taking notes frantically. The cemetery superintendent was standing frozen, staring at the casket. I kept thinking about the funeral, Harold said, about how peaceful she'd looked, about how I'd checked for signs of life, checked for breathing, checked for pulse, checked for rigor mortis. She'd been checked at the hospital, pronounced dead by a doctor. How could this have happened? The medical examiner ordered immediate transport to the morgue. The casket was sealed again, loaded onto Harold's hearse. Harold had driven to the medical examiner's office with a police escort, trying to process what he'd seen. The full autopsy took 2 days, Harold said. Dr. Martinez called me personally to explain the findings. He wanted me to understand, wanted me to know this wasn't my fault. But I still felt responsible. Rebecca Valdez had suffered what's called a cataleptic seizure, a rare condition where the body enters a state that mimics death. Breathing becomes undetectable. The heart rate drops so low it can't be measured with standard equipment. The body temperature drops. Muscles become rigid. To all observable signs, the person appears dead. In 1978, we didn't have the advanced monitoring equipment we have now, Harold said. No EEG machines to measure brain activity. No sophisticated methods to confirm cardiac death. Doctors relied on observation, stethoscope, pulse check, visual examination, And in Rebecca's case, all those signs indicated death. But Rebecca hadn't been dead. She'd been in a deep coma, a cataleptic state that mimicked death so completely that even the hospital staff had been fooled. And at some point after burial, Dr. Martinez estimated within 6 to 12 hours she'd woken up. The autopsy showed cause of death as asphyxiation, Harold said. She'd suffocated, run out of oxygen in the sealed casket. But the positioning of the body, the condition of the hands, the scratch marks, all of it indicated she'd been conscious, aware, trying desperately to get out. Dr. Martinez had estimated Rebecca had been alive and conscious in that casket for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours before the oxygen ran out. 30 minutes to 2 hours of scratching, clawing, screaming in darkness, knowing she was buried alive, knowing no one could hear her. The police investigated, Harold said, investigated the hospital, the attending physician, me, the funeral home, looking for negligence, looking for someone to blame. But Dr. Martinez testified that this was a medical phenomenon, extremely rare, that the cataleptic state had fooled everyone, that by 1978 standards of practice, all proper procedures had been followed. The case never went to trial. The insurance company paid the claim. The family, devastated by the revelation of how Rebecca had actually died, settled quietly. The hospital updated its protocols, and Harold Gutierrez changed everything about how he approached his work. I started doing additional checks, Harold said, things that weren't standard at the time. I'd wait longer before preparing bodies. Watch for any signs of breathing, any movement. I installed a mirror system, would hold a mirror under the nose, watch for condensation. I'd check body temperature multiple times, check for lever mortis, the settling of blood that only happens after true death. Harold had also advocated for changes in Texas funeral industry regulations, pushed for mandatory wait times between death pronouncement and preparation, pushed for additional verification protocols. Some of his suggestions were adopted, others weren't. The funeral industry changed a lot after cases like Rebecca's became known, Harold said. Modern embalming procedures include verification steps. Hospitals have better monitoring equipment. Death has to be confirmed with more rigorous testing. But in 1978, we were still relying on methods from the 19th century. Harold had kept the photographs from Rebecca's exhumation, not officially. Those evidence were sealed after the investigation, but he'd made copies, kept them in a locked file in his office for his entire career. Sometimes when he was preparing a body, when he had any doubt at all, he'd look at those photographs, remind himself what could happen if he missed something. I showed those photos to every apprentice who worked for me, Harold said. Not to scare them, to educate them, to make sure they understood that our job isn't just making bodies look nice for viewing. Our job is making absolutely certain that the person we're preparing is actually dead, because if we fail at that, the consequences are unimaginable. Harold had tried to contact Rebecca's family years later, wanted to apologize, to explain, to offer whatever comfort he could. They'd refused to meet with him. He understood. How do you face the man who buried your mother alive, even if it wasn't his fault? I think about Rebecca often, Harold said, especially at night. I think about those 30 minutes, those 2 hours, what she must have thought, what she must have felt. Waking up in nakedness, in a confined space, realizing where she was. The panic, the terror, scratching at the lid until her fingernails broke, screaming until the air ran out. He pulled out a folder, opened it carefully. Inside were photocopied documents, the original autopsy report, the exhumation order, and photographs. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough. The shredded satin lining, the scratched wood, the twisted body, the broken fingernails. This is why protocols matter, Harold said. This is why we have regulations. This is why funeral directors spend years in training. Because this, he gestured to the photographs, this can never happen again, should never happen again. But it did happen. To Rebecca Valdez, in Houston, Texas. And I was there. Harold closed the folder, put it back in his desk drawer. At 79, he'd been retired for 9 years. But he still woke up sometimes, thinking about that August morning, about opening that casket, about seeing those scratch marks. You want to know what I believe? Harold said. I believe catalepsy is more common than we know. I believe there are probably people throughout history who were buried alive, who woke up in coffins, who died the way Rebecca died, and we'll never know, because most of them were never exhumed. He walked me to the door. Outside, the Texas heat was oppressive, normal, alive. Modern medicine has gotten better, Harold said. We have EEGs, we have cardiac monitors, we have brain death protocols, but we're still human. We still make mistakes. And that's why I tell this story. Because complacency kills. Because assuming someone is dead isn't enough. Because we have to check. And check again. And be absolutely certain. Harold Gutierrez closed the door, and I walked to my car thinking about Rebecca Valdez, about a woman who woke up in a coffin, who clawed at the lid until her fingernails broke, who died underground, alone, in darkness, buried alive because of a rare medical condition that fooled everyone. The rational part of me knows this was a tragedy, a medical phenomenon, a failure of 1970s diagnostic capabilities. Not malice, not negligence, just the limitations of what was possible to detect at the time. But I can't stop thinking about those scratch marks, about 4 parallel lines gouged into wood, about broken fingernails, about a body that shifted position, knees bent, hands twisted, because she'd been moving, fighting, trying to survive. Maybe Rebecca Valdez is the reason modern death protocols are so rigorous. Maybe her death, her real death, her second death, her death by suffocation in a sealed casket, saved countless others. Maybe every time a doctor waits an extra hour before pronouncing death, every time a funeral director does one more check, every time someone looks twice at a body that seems too lifelike, Rebecca's legacy is there, a reminder that death must be certain, that being mostly dead isn't enough, that the difference between life and death is sometimes so subtle that only time and technology can reveal it, and that the worst nightmare, waking up in your own coffin, isn't just a horror story. Sometimes it's real. And when it is, the evidence is written on the inside of the casket lid, in scratch marks, in broken nails, in the desperate final moments of someone who died twice. Once when everyone thought she was dead, and once when she actually was. Antoine Broussard worked cemetery maintenance in New Orleans, Louisiana for 8 years before the day in September 2017 when he opened the Rousseau family crypt and heard it scream. He'd worked in some of the oldest above-ground cemeteries in America, had opened hundreds of crypts and vaults, had seen the expected decay and disarray that comes with a century and a half of burial. But he'd never heard the dead scream before, never seen bones arranged in ways that defied explanation. He quit that night. Never went back. Never worked cemetery maintenance again. I met Antoine at a cafe in the French Quarter in March 2024. He'd moved to Baton Rouge after leaving cemetery work, now drove trucks for a shipping company. He'd been hesitant to talk about what happened, said he'd spent years trying to forget. But over chicory, coffee and beignets he barely touched. He told me about the Rousseau crypt, about the sound that came from inside, about what they found when they looked. New Orleans cemeteries are different, Antoine said, his hands wrapped tight around his coffee cup. We bury above ground. Water tables too high for traditional graves, so we have these crypts, stone buildings, family tombs, some of them dating back to the 70s. And when a family dies out, when there's no one left to maintain them, those crypts just sit, sealed, waiting. Antoine had worked for the Historic Cemetery Preservation Society. His job was maintenance, restoration, sometimes relocation. When old crypts were in danger of collapse, when families requested remains moved to new locations, Antoine's crew would open them, document the contents, carefully transfer the remains. The Rousseau crypt was in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, Antoine said. Built in 1847, the family was prominent, Creole, wealthy, owned plantations outside the city. But the last Rousseau died in 1921. For 96 years that crypt had been sealed. No one maintaining it, no one visiting, just sitting there slowly deteriorating. September 14, 2017, Antoine's crew had been contracted to relocate the Rousseau remains. A distant relative, some fifth cousin who'd done genealogy research, had purchased a modern plot and wanted the family consolidated. Legal papers were in order. The Preservation Society had approved the work. There were 4 of us, Antoine said. Me, my supervisor Luis Delgado, and 2 other workers, Jerome Washington and Carlos Mendez. We'd done this kind of work before. Opened old crypts, moved remains. It was delicate work, respectful work, but it was routine. The Rousseau crypt was typical construction. Brick and plaster, about 8 feet wide by 12 feet deep. A heavy iron door with an ornate lock. No windows. The kind of structure designed to last centuries. But time and New Orleans humidity had taken their toll. The plaster was crumbling. The brickwork was compromised. Water damage was evident. We arrived around 8 a.m., Antoine said. September in New Orleans. Already 80 degrees. Humid. The kind of weather that makes everything stick to your skin. We set up our equipment, portable lights, documentation cameras, protective gear. Standard procedure. Louis had taken photographs of the exterior first. Documented the condition of the crypt before they touched anything. Then they'd approached the door. The lock was rusted solid. They'd had to cut it with bolt cutters. I remember putting my hand on that door, Antoine said quietly. It was cold, which was strange because everything else in the cemetery was hot. The tombs, the ground, the air, everything was hot. But that door was cold, like touching ice. They'd pulled the door open slowly. The hinges screamed, rusted metal grinding against stone. But that was normal. Expected. What wasn't normal was what happened next. The seal broke, Antoine said. You could hear it, that pop when pressure equalizes. And then this sound came out. This scream, high-pitched, loud. Like something was dying inside that crypt. Like something was being released. All 4 men had stepped back. The scream lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then stopped abruptly. Silence. Antoine had looked at Luis. Luis had looked at Jerome and Carlos. Nobody spoke. They all stood there staring at the open doorway, at the darkness inside. Luis said it was just air, Antoine said. Said when crypts are sealed for decades, air pressure builds up. When you break the seal, the air escapes fast through small openings. Makes sounds. Screams, whistles, groans. It's physics. It's not supernatural. Antoine had heard this before, understood the science. But the sound hadn't been like air whistling through a gap. It had been too human, too anguished, too much like an actual scream. We put on our respirators, Antoine said. Standard procedure. Old crypts can have dangerous gases. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, stuff that'll kill you if you breathe it. We waited 10 minutes for the air to clear. Then Louis and I went inside first. The interior of the Rousseau crypt was a single chamber. Stone shelves lined both walls, 6 shelves total, designed to hold coffins. Portable lights illuminated the space. And what Antoine saw made his blood run cold. The coffins were destroyed, Antoine said. Not decayed. Destroyed. Shattered. Wood fragments everywhere. Casket hardware, handles, hinges, scattered on the floor. And the bones all over. Skulls, ribs, femurs. Not organized. Not lying where coffins would have been. Just like someone had taken the coffins and thrown them against the walls. Antoine had done dozens of historic exhumations, seen coffins that had collapsed from age, wood that had rotted away, bones that had tumbled when supports failed. That was normal, expected. But this was different. The distribution pattern was wrong, too chaotic, too violent. Louis was cataloguing, Antoine said. Counting skulls, trying to identify how many bodies we were dealing with. The record said 9 Rousseaus were entombed here, adults and children. Louis counted 10 skulls. 10. Someone extra was in there. They'd photographed everything, documented the chaos. And that's when Antoine saw it. The thing that made him understand this wasn't normal decay or structural collapse. There was a child's coffin, Antoine said. Smaller than the others. It was on the lowest shelf, mostly intact. The wood was rotted, but the shape was still there. You could see it had been a child's casket, maybe 3 feet long, for an infant or toddler. And on top of that casket, placed carefully, deliberately, was a skull. An adult skull, not a child's. Positioned face down, looking at the small coffin below. The placement was too precise to be accidental, too intentional to be the result of decay or collapse. I said to Louise, "How did that get there?" Antoine said. And Louise just stared at it, shook his head, said, "I don't know. That shouldn't be possible. The physics didn't work. If the adult coffins above had collapsed, bones would have fallen straight down, scattered, not placed neatly on top of a lower coffin, and that skull wasn't resting naturally. It was positioned, deliberately turned to look down at the child's casket. Jerome and Carlos came in, Antoine said, saw what we were seeing. Carlos made the sign of the cross. Jerome said we should leave. Said this wasn't right. Said we should seal it back up and walk away. But Louis had responsibilities. Contracts. Legal obligations. He'd called the Preservation Society director, explained the situation. The director had instructed them to continue, document everything, photograph everything, complete the relocation. We worked for 3 more hours, Antoine said, carefully collecting bones, identifying what we could. The Preservation Society had brought in a forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Sharon LeBlanc. She examined everything on site, tried to make sense of what we'd found. Dr. LeBlanc had confirmed the chaos, said the pattern of bone distribution was inconsistent with natural decay or structural failure. Said it looked like the interior of the crypt had been disturbed. But disturbed by what? The crypt had been sealed for 96 years. The door had been intact, no signs of break-in, no way for anyone to enter. Dr. LeBlanc examined the skull on the child's coffin. Antoine said, "Adult male," she determined. Middle-aged. And she found something else. The skull had damage, fractures, the kind that happen from impact, from being hit. She said the injuries were perimortem around the time of death. Said this man had died violently. Antoine had looked through the burial records, the Rousseau family history, found that one of the people entombed in that crypt was André Rousseau, died 1889, age 42. The death certificate listed cause as accidental fall, but there were newspaper articles from the time, rumors, whispers of domestic violence, of a man who'd beaten his wife, who'd been cruel to his children. Henry's wife was buried there too, Antoine said. Marie Rousseau, died 1885, age 36. 4 years before Henri, the record said she died of pneumonia, but she'd been hospitalized multiple times before that. Broken bones, injuries consistent with abuse. And the child's coffin? That belonged to their daughter, Amélie Rousseau, died 1883, age 2. Cause of death listed as failure to thrive, a Victorian-era term that could mean anything from malnutrition to neglect. I stood in that crypt, Antoine said, looking at that skull positioned over that tiny coffin, and I thought, what if André did this? What if he killed his daughter, beat his wife, and when they were all buried together, when the family sealed them in, something happened, something moved that skull, put it there, made him face what he'd done. Dr. Leblanc had no explanation for the placement. Said that without evidence of human entry, without disturbance to the seal, she couldn't account for how bones had been rearranged. She documented everything. Recommended the remains be separated. Henry Rousseau buried apart from his wife and child in the new plot. We finished the relocation that afternoon, Antoine said. Packed everything up, transported the remains. But I couldn't shake it. Couldn't stop thinking about that scream when we opened the door, about those shattered coffin, about that skull placed so carefully, so deliberately, looking down at a child's grave. Antoine had gone home that evening, showered, tried to eat, but his hands were shaking. He kept seeing that skull, kept hearing that scream. Around 8 p.m., he'd called Louise, told him he was done, couldn't do this work anymore. Louise had tried to talk him out of it, said it was just a weird situation, said they'd seen strange things before. But we hadn't, Antoine said. Not like this. I'd seen decay, I'd seen bones, I'd seen coffins collapse. But I'd never seen bones arranged with intention. I'd seen evidence that the dead could move, could act, could place a skull exactly where it needed to be. Antoine had quit that night, never went back to the cemetery, never finished out his notice. The Preservation Society mailed him his final paycheck. He'd moved to Baton Rouge within a month, started driving trucks, normal work, predictable work, work that didn't involve opening crypts and finding the impossible. I talked to Dr. Leblanc later, Antoine said, maybe 6 months after. Called her out of curiosity, asked if she'd figured anything out. She said no, said it remained unexplained, said that in 30 years of forensic anthropology she'd never seen anything like it, and she'd examined hundreds of historical burial sites. Dr. Leblanc had told Antoine something else, something she couldn't put in her official report. She said that in her professional opinion the bones in that crypt had been moved recently. Not a century ago when the last burial happened. Recently, within the past 10 or 20 years, the dust patterns, the way bones were positioned over other remains, all of it suggested recent disturbance. But the seal was intact, Antoine said. We documented that. The door hadn't been opened. The walls showed no signs of entry. So how does something move bones inside a sealed crypt? Antoine had researched Henri Rousseau after that, found everything he could. Court records from the 1880s, newspaper articles, letters written by neighbors. A picture emerged of a violent man, a man who'd terrorized his family, who'd possibly caused the deaths of his wife and daughter, who'd been buried in the same crypt with them, because that's what families did in the 19th century. They stayed together, even in death. "I think about that skull a lot," Antoine said, "about it resting on Amelie's coffin, face down, looking at her. And I think, what if the dead have agency we don't want? What if they can move, can act, can create tableaus that tell stories, can position themselves to show us what happened, to testify?" He finished his coffee, cold now. Outside, French Quarter tourists walked past. Normal life, normal New Orleans. The living city built on top of cities of the dead. "You want to know what I believe?" Antoine said. "I believe that Scream was real. Not air escaping. Real. Something in that crypt screamed when we broke the seal. Screamed because it had been waiting for someone to see, to witness, to understand." Antoine stood up, prepared to leave. "And I believe Henri Rousseau's skull was placed on his daughter's coffin as evidence," Antoine said. "Evidence of what he did. Evidence that couldn't be hidden, that the dead wouldn't allow to be hidden, because maybe the dead can't speak, can't testify in court, can't point fingers, but they can move bones, can arrange remains, can create scenes that ask questions we can't ignore." Antoine Broussard left the cafe that afternoon, heading back to Baton Rouge, back to his truck driving job, where the strangest thing he'd encounter was traffic or bad weather. And I sat there thinking about the Rousseau crypt, about a scream that came from darkness, about shattered coffins and bones scattered with impossible intention, about a skull positioned over a child's grave. The rational explanation is physics and decay, air pressure released, structural failure, bones falling randomly and appearing intentional through coincidence. Dr. Leblanc's assessment of recent disturbance, explained by she doesn't know what. But Antoine heard that scream, felt that cold door, saw that skull positioned with such precision that 4 experienced workers all knew it wasn't accidental. Maybe the Rousseau crypt held more than bones. Maybe it held testimony, evidence. Story told by the dead because the living never asked the right questions in 1883 Maybe Henri Rousseau's skull was moved by something, someone who wanted us to see him looking down at what he destroyed, at the daughter he killed, at the guilt he couldn't escape, not even after a century in a sealed crypt. Because death might seal your body in stone, but it doesn't seal your crimes, doesn't hide what you did. And sometimes the dead find ways to tell the truth, even if it takes even if it requires moving bones in a locked crypt, even if it means screaming when someone finally opens the door, because silence protects the guilty and the dead. Maybe the dead are tired of being silent.
Dr. Patricia Sullivan worked as a county coroner in Lexington, Kentucky, for 31 years before the exhumation in March 2011 taught her that medical mistakes don't stay buried. They come back up with the bodies, written in bent nails and shredded fingertips, and faces frozen in expressions that the dead shouldn't be able to make. She'd performed over 3,000 autopsies, had examined bodies in every condition, had seen death in all its forms, but she'd never seen proof of the nightmare everyone fears. Never seen evidence that someone had woken up in their coffin, never seen a face that told her, beyond any doubt, that this man had died twice. Once when the doctor said he was dead, and once when he actually was. I met Dr. Sullivan at a medical conference in Louisville in September 2024. She'd retired 3 years earlier, but still lectured occasionally on forensic pathology. She'd agreed to discuss the exhumation after I'd assured her the criminal case was closed, the appeals exhausted. The family had given permission. We sat in a quiet conference room after her lecture, and she told me about the day they dug up Marcus Boone, about what they found 6 feet down, about the evidence that should never exist, Marcus Boone died on February 7, 2010, Dr. Sullivan said. Her hands flat on the table. At least that's what the death certificate said. He was 49 years old, type 1 diabetic, found unresponsive in his home by his brother. Paramedics called, pronounced dead at the scene by the attending physician. Marcus had lived alone in a small house outside Lexington. He'd been diabetic since childhood, managed it with insulin and diet. His brother Dennis Boone checked on him regularly. On February 7th, Dennis had stopped by and found Marcus unconscious on the floor. No pulse, no breathing, skin cold. Dennis called 911. The responding physician was Dr. Andrew Garrison, Dr. Sullivan said. Young doctor recently completed his residency. He examined Marcus at the scene, checked for vital signs, found none, pronounced him dead. Time of death, 11:47 a.m. The standard protocol in Kentucky for deaths outside hospitals required the body be examined by the county coroner if there were any questions. But Dr. Garrison had been confident. Natural death, diabetic, with known health issues. No signs of trauma, no reason for suspicion. He'd signed the death certificate, cause of death. Diabetic ketoacidosis. Marcus's funeral was February 10th, Dr. Sullivan said. 3 days later, his brother Dennis arranged everything. Small service, burial at Bluegrass Memorial Gardens. Marcus was placed in a standard casket, sealed, and buried. Everything normal, everything proper. 13 months later, Dr. Sullivan received a call from the Kentucky State Police. They were investigating Marcus Boone's death. New evidence had emerged. They suspected foul play. They needed an exhumation and full forensic autopsy. The investigation centered on Marcus's ex-wife, Carol Boone, Dr. Sullivan said. They divorced 2 years before his death. Bitter divorce. Custody battle over their teenage daughter. Carol stood to inherit Marcus's life insurance, $200,000, if their daughter was in her custody when Marcus died. Police had discovered that Carol had visited Marcus the night before he died. Neighbors had seen her car. There'd been an argument. And Carol had a history. A previous boyfriend had died under suspicious circumstances years earlier. Never charged, but investigated. Now police were looking at Marcus's death differently. March 23, 2011, Dr. Sullivan said. That's when we did the exhumation. I was there with 2 detectives, a forensic team, and the cemetery superintendent. We'd obtained all the proper court orders. Dennis Boone was present. He wanted to know the truth. The crew at Bluegrass Memorial had located Marcus's grave without difficulty. Plot 127, Section G. They'd begun excavation at dawn. By 9 a.m., they'd reached the burial vault, pulled it up, set it on the grass beside the grave. We opened the vault, Dr. Sullivan said, and immediately, I knew something was wrong. The casket inside wasn't positioned the way it should have been. It was tilted, rotated, not lying flat and level as it should be in an undisturbed vault. The casket had moved. At first, I thought maybe the vault had shifted, Dr. Sullivan said. Ground settling, water intrusion, something mechanical. But when we lifted the casket out, we saw it was worse than that. The casket had rotated 180 degrees. It was upside down. Complete inversion. The bottom of the casket was facing up. The top, the side with the lid, was facing down. The casket had somehow flipped inside the vault. Dennis Boone said, "How did that happen?" Dr. Sullivan said, and nobody had an answer. Caskets don't flip themselves. They're heavy. This one was steel, probably 400 pounds with the body. There's no mechanism that would cause a casket to invert inside a sealed vault. They'd transported the casket, still inverted, to the medical examiner's facility, set it carefully on the examination table. Dr. Sullivan and her assistant had examined the exterior carefully. The casket showed significant damage. Scratches. The finish was scraped in multiple places. Then we righted the casket, Dr. Sullivan said. Carefully turned it over so it was positioned normally. and we prepared to open it. Dr. Sullivan had opened thousands of caskets for forensic examination, knew what to expect at various stages of decomposition. Marcus had been buried for 13 months. In Kentucky climate, in a sealed steel casket, she expected moderate decomposition. Bones would be visible, soft tissue would be significantly degraded, but structural form would remain. I broke the seal, Dr. Sullivan said quietly, and the smell was immediate. Not just decomposition, something else. Something that made my assistant step back. They'd lifted the lid, and what Dr. Sullivan saw made her understand why the casket had been upside down. The interior was destroyed, Dr. Sullivan said. The satin lining was torn to shreds, completely shredded, and the lid, the inside of the lid, was damaged. The padding was ripped away. The metal underneath showed impact marks, dents, and the nails. The casket lid had decorative nails around the inner perimeter, small brass nails that held the satin lining in place. Those nails were bent, not pushed in. Bent outward, like something had been pushing from inside, like force had been applied from below, bending the nails up and out. Then I looked at Marcus. Dr. Sullivan said, her voice barely audible, and I saw his face. Decomposition had occurred. 13 months of normal post-mortem changes, but the facial structure was still identifiable, still showed expression, and that expression was terror, absolute terror. His mouth was open, Dr. Sullivan said. Wide open, jaw dislocated, like he'd been screaming. His eyes, the sockets showed evidence his eyes had been open, and his position. His body was twisted, contorted, not lying peacefully on his back, the way he'd been positioned at burial. He was on his side, arms up, hands near his face. Dr. Sullivan had examined the hands immediately. Both hands showed extreme damage. The fingertips were shredded, tissue destroyed, bone exposed, and under what remained of the tissue splinters, wood and fabric fragments, the same material from the casket lining and lid. He'd clawed at the lid, Dr. Sullivan said. Clawed until his fingertips were destroyed, until bone was exposed, until he couldn't claw anymore. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Boone had been alive when they buried him, had woken up in that casket, had realized where he was, had tried desperately to escape, had clawed and pushed and fought until the casket flipped, probably from his thrashing, probably from the force of his movement in the confined space, had continued fighting until he'd run out of air, until he'd suffocated, until he'd actually died. I've never felt so sick performing an autopsy, Dr. Sullivan said. Never felt so horrified by what I was seeing. Because this was preventable. This was a mistake. Marcus Boone wasn't murdered. He was buried alive because a doctor made a mistake. Dr. Sullivan had performed the full autopsy, found no evidence of poisoning, no evidence of foul play. Carol Boone hadn't killed Marcus. But Dr. Sullivan had found something else, evidence of what had actually happened. Marcus showed signs of severe diabetic ketoacidosis, Dr. Sullivan said. His organs showed the damage pattern, and more importantly, I found evidence he'd been in a diabetic coma when he was pronounced dead. Diabetic coma can mimic death. Breathing becomes so shallow, it's undetectable without proper equipment. Heart rate drops to nearly nothing. Body temperature plummets. Blood pressure becomes unmeasurable. To an inexperienced observer, even a doctor who doesn't check carefully, the patient appears dead. Dr. Garrison had been negligent. Dr. Sullivan said he'd made a cursory examination, hadn't used proper diagnostic equipment, hadn't checked thoroughly. He'd been overconfident, and he'd pronounced a living man dead. The investigation expanded. Police reviewed Dr. Garrison's credentials, his training, his history, found that he'd been fast-tracked through medical school, had barely passed his licensing exams, had been flagged during his residency for cutting corners, but he'd been licensed, had been working, had been making life and death decisions. The horror is that Marcus probably woke up hours after burial, Dr. Sullivan said. Diabetic comas can last hours, sometimes days. He was buried at noon on February 10th. If he woke up that evening, he'd have been underground for 6, 8, maybe 10 hours before regaining consciousness. Woke up in darkness, in a sealed casket, 6 feet under, and tried to get out. Dr. Sullivan had estimated the time Marcus survived after waking, based on the oxygen capacity of the casket, based on the extent of his injuries, based on the evidence of his struggle. She estimated between 2 and 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours of consciousness in that coffin, knowing he was buried, fighting to survive. The casket had flipped because of his thrashing, Dr. Sullivan said. He'd been violent in his movements, desperate. The casket had rocked, had shifted, had eventually inverted, which meant he'd spent part of his conscious time upside down, disoriented, trapped, still fighting. Dr. Garrison was charged with negligent homicide. The trial was brief. Dr. Sullivan's testimony was definitive. The physical evidence was undeniable. Dr. Garrison was convicted in November 2011, sentenced to 15 years in prison. Lost his medical license permanently. But that doesn't bring Marcus back, Dr. Sullivan said. Doesn't undo what happened to him. Doesn't erase those final hours of terror. Dennis Boone had been destroyed by the revelation. His brother hadn't died peacefully of natural causes. He died screaming in a coffin. Dennis had been present at the burial, had watched them lower the casket, had thrown dirt on the grave, had no idea Marcus was alive inside. Dennis sued the cemetery, the funeral home, Dr. Garrison, the hospital, Dr. Sullivan said. Won every case, settled, for millions. But money doesn't fix this. Nothing fixes this. Dr. Sullivan had recommended changes to Kentucky death verification protocols after the case. Mandatory waiting periods before burial, required use of diagnostic equipment, multiple physician verification for deaths outside hospitals. Some were adopted, others were deemed too expensive or impractical. I testified before the state medical board, Dr. Sullivan said, showed them the photographs. The bent nails, the shredded fingertips, the expression of terror, told them this is what happens when protocols aren't followed. When doctors are careless, when we assume death without verifying it, absolutely. The case had haunted Dr. Sullivan for years. She'd taken a leave of absence after the autopsy, seen a therapist, struggled with nightmares. How many times had she signed death certificates? How many bodies had she examined? Had she ever made a mistake? Had she ever pronounced someone dead who wasn't? I became obsessive about verification, Dr. Sullivan said. Started using equipment I'd never used before. Started doing tests I'd considered unnecessary, because I never wanted to make Dr. Garrison's mistake. Never wanted to be responsible for someone being buried alive. So Dr. Sullivan had kept the photographs from Marcus Boone's autopsy, used them in her lectures, showed them to medical students, explained what happens when you don't follow protocol, when you cut corners, when you assume. Those bent nails, Dr. Sullivan said. That's what I show them. Those nails were bent by a living human being pushing against them, trying to get out, trying to survive. That's not decomposition. That's not post-mortem movement. That's evidence of life, evidence of consciousness, evidence of terror. She pulled out her laptop, opened a folder, showed me the photographs. The casket interior, destroyed, the bent nails, the shredded fingertips, and Marcus's face, the expression preserved enough to see the terror. This is what medical negligence looks like. Dr. Sullivan said, this is what happens when doctors don't verify death properly. This is what happens when we fail our patients. And Dr. Sullivan had stayed in contact with Dennis Boone over the years. He'd never recovered emotionally, had moved away from Kentucky, changed careers. Tried to rebuild his life, but he'd never forgotten, never stopped blaming himself for not questioning the death certificate, for not demanding more verification. Dennis told me something years later, Dr. Sullivan said. He said on the day of the funeral, when they were closing the casket, he thought he saw Marcus's eyelid twitch, just a tiny movement. But everyone told him it was his imagination, told him it was grief, told him the dead sometimes seemed to move, so he didn't say anything, didn't delay the funeral, and his brother was buried alive. That detail haunted Dr. Sullivan as much as the evidence. The possibility that if Dennis had spoken up, if he'd insisted on more examination, if someone had listened, Marcus might have been saved. "You want to know what I believe?" Dr. Sullivan said. "I believe death verification protocols exist for a reason. I believe multiple checks and diagnostic equipment and waiting periods are necessary because the human body can fool us, because doctors make mistakes, because what looks like death sometimes isn't." She closed her laptop, put it away. "And I believe Marcus Boone's death, his real death, his second death, his death by suffocation in a sealed casket, should never be forgotten, because he is proof that our worst nightmare is real, that being buried alive isn't just a horror story, that it can happen, that it has happened, that without proper protocols, it will happen again." Dr. Patricia Sullivan left the conference that afternoon, heading back to her retirement, where she didn't have to examine bodies anymore, didn't have to sign death certificates, didn't have to carry the weight of verification. And I sat there thinking about Marcus Boone, about a man who woke up in his coffin, who clawed until his fingertips were gone, who pushed so hard against the lid that he bent metal nails, who fought so desperately that he flipped a 400-pound casket upside down, who died screaming in darkness, 6 feet underground, because a doctor didn't check carefully enough. The rational explanation is medical error. Diabetic coma misdiagnosed as death. Negligence, inadequate examination. All true, all documented, all proven in court. But that doesn't make it less horrifying. Doesn't make those bent nails less real. Doesn't make Marcus's terror less absolute. Maybe every death should be verified twice. Maybe every body should wait longer before burial. Maybe every doctor should see those photographs of Marcus Boone's fingertips. See the bent nails. See the destroyed casket lining. See the face frozen in terror. And remember that death isn't always what it seems, that the body can fool even trained physicians, that what looks like death might be coma, might be suspended animation, might be something that wears off hours after burial. And when it does, when consciousness returns, when someone wakes up in a sealed casket 6 feet underground, they fight, they claw, they push, they bend metal nails with bare hands, they flip 400-pound caskets, they scream until the air runs out, and they die knowing exactly where they are, knowing they're buried, knowing no one can hear them, knowing they're going to suffocate. That's what the bent nails tell us. That's what the shredded fingertips prove. That Marcus Boone died twice, and the second time, he knew it was happening. Dr. Ramon Santos worked as a forensic pathologist in Manila for 19 years, before the exhumation in June 2012 showed him something that medical science couldn't explain. He'd examined over 2,000 bodies, had seen every stage of decomposition, had documented the predictable progression of death and decay, but he'd never seen a body that refused to follow the rules, never touched skin that shouldn't be soft, never felt warmth where there should only be cold. The case of Sofia Reyes, the 3-year-old girl they called the sleeping angel, the child who'd been dead for 2 years but looked like she'd died yesterday, and felt, when Dr. Santos touched her hand, impossibly warm. I met Dr. Santos at his office in Quezon City in August 2024. He'd been reluctant to discuss the case publicly, had declined interviews for years, but he'd agreed to talk now because, he said, there are things medicine can't explain, and pretending otherwise is dishonest. We sat in his consultation room, air conditioning humming against Manila's heat, and he told me about the day they opened Sofia's grave, about what they found, about what he felt. Sofia Reyes died on May 3, 2010, Dr. Santos said, his hands folded on his desk. She was 3 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She'd been sick for 8 months. Her family had done everything, chemotherapy, hospital stays, everything they could afford. But the cancer was aggressive. Sofia died in her sleep at home, in her mother's arms. Sofia's family lived in Taguig, a district in Metro Manila, working-class family. The father, Eduardo, worked construction. The mother, Maria, stayed home with their 3 children. Sofia was the youngest. When she died, the family had scraped together everything they had for a proper funeral. The funeral was May 6, 2010, Dr. Santos said. 3 days after her death, traditional Catholic service, Sofia was buried at Manila Memorial Park. Her family visited her grave every week for 2 years, brought flowers, prayed, maintained the gravesite. In April 2012, 2 years after Sofia's death, the cemetery management contacted the Reyes family. There was a problem with the cemetery section where Sofia was buried, ground instability. Several graves needed to be relocated to a different section. The cemetery would handle everything, but the family needed to give permission. The Reyes family agreed, Dr. Santos said. But Maria, Sofia's mother, had a request. She wanted to see her daughter one more time, wanted the casket opened before reburial. The cemetery initially refused, said it wasn't advisable, said after 2 years the body wouldn't be viewable. But Maria insisted, and eventually they agreed. The cemetery had contacted Dr. Santos because they needed a medical professional present for the exhumation and opening. Standard procedure when families requested to view remains after extended burial. Dr. Santos had agreed. He'd handled many such cases, knew what to expect. June 8, 2012, Dr. Santos said. That's when we did the exhumation, morning around 8 a.m. The cemetery crew had prepared everything. I was there with Maria and Eduardo Reyes, their parish priest, Father Miguel Cruz, and several cemetery staff members. The excavation had been routine. Sofia's grave was in the old section, ground-level burial, no vault, just the casket in the earth. The crew had dug carefully, reached the casket by 9 a.m. It was a small white casket, child-sized, showing 2 years of ground contact, but structurally intact. We lifted it out, Dr. Santos said. Set it carefully on the grass under a tent we'd erected for privacy, and I examined it before opening. The casket had been sealed, not professionally, but adequately. There was soil compacted around the seal, no evidence of water intrusion or disturbance. Dr. Santos had explained to Maria and Eduardo what they should expect. After 2 years in Manila's tropical climate, in ground burial with no vault, Sofia's body would be significantly decomposed, possibly skeletal, certainly not recognizable. He'd wanted to prepare them, wanted to prevent trauma. But Maria insisted she needed to see. Dr. Santos said she needed to say goodbye properly, so I prepared to open the casket. Dr. Santos had broken the seal carefully, expected the immediate smell of decomposition, expected to see advanced decay, expected what he'd seen dozens of times before in 2-year-old burials. I lifted the lid, Dr. Santos said, quietly, and there was no smell, no odor of decomposition, just nothing, like opening an empty box. Inside the casket was Sofia, wearing the white dress she'd been buried in, hands folded on her chest, eyes closed, and completely, impossibly preserved. She looked like she was sleeping, Dr. Santos said. Her skin was intact, not discolored, not showing any signs of decay. Her face was peaceful. Her hair was still in place. Her eyelashes were intact, delicate, visible, like she'd just closed her eyes. Maria had gasped. Eduardo had crossed himself. Father Cruz had begun praying, and Dr. Santos had stood there, staring, trying to process what he was seeing. What shouldn't be possible. I checked the casket interior, Dr. Santos said. looked for evidence of unusual preservation conditions. Some caskets create microenvironments that can slow decay, airtight seals, chemical interactions, particular conditions, but this casket was standard. Wood, simple construction, not designed for preservation. Dr. Santos had examined Sophia more closely. Her dress was clean, no staining from decomposition fluids. Her skin showed no mummification, no saponification, the waxy transformation that sometimes occurs in bodies buried in certain soils. She looked fresh, recent, like she'd been prepared yesterday. I told everyone I needed to examine her, Dr. Santos said. Needed to verify this was actually Sophia Reyes. Needed to understand what I was seeing. Maria gave permission. And I touched her. Dr. Santos had placed his hand on Sophia's hand. The small 3-year-old hand, and what he felt made him pull back involuntarily. Warmth, Dr. Santos said. Her hand was warm, not body temperature, but warm. Warmer than the ambient air. Warmer than the casket wood. Warm. Dr. Santos had checked his own hand. Wondered if he'd imagined it. Touched Sophia's hand again. Same sensation. Definite warmth. Not hot, but noticeably warm. Room temperature would be around 28 degrees Celsius in Manila's morning heat. Sophia's hand felt closer to 32-33 degrees. Body temperature is 37 degrees. Sophia's hand was somewhere in between. I checked for signs of life, Dr. Santos said. I know that sounds absurd. Sophia had been dead for 2 years. But I checked anyway. No pulse, no breathing, no response to stimuli. She was dead, had been dead. But her body was warm and perfectly preserved. Dr. Santos had examined her carefully, checked her skin elasticity, checked her joints. Bodies in advanced decomposition are rigid, desiccated. Sophia's body had normal flexibility. Her skin had normal texture. Not fresh, there was a quality to it that indicated death, but not decayed. I performed a minimal examination, Dr. Santos said. Documented everything. Took photographs, measured temperature, and I had no explanation. This violated everything I knew about post-mortem decomposition. The news spread quickly. Within hours, people were gathering at the cemetery. Word had gotten out about the perfectly preserved child, about the sleeping angel. By afternoon, there were hundreds of people trying to see Sophia. The cemetery had to close the area, called security. The Catholic Church got involved. Dr. Santos said. Father Cruz had reported what he'd seen. The archdiocese sent representatives. They examined Sophia, documented her condition, and they began investigating for possible sainthood. Incorruptibility, the failure of a body to decay, is considered a sign of holiness in Catholic tradition. Scientists arrived too. A team from the University of the Philippines, soil experts, microbiologists, forensic specialists. They took samples from the gravesite, analyzed the soil, tested for chemical composition, looked for anything that might explain preservation. The soil was ordinary, Dr. Santos said. Slightly acidic, well-drained, nothing special, no chemicals, no unusual mineral content, nothing that would preserve a body. In fact, the conditions were ideal for decomposition. Warm, tropical, moist. Sophia should have decomposed rapidly. The casket was examined by materials scientists. Standard wood construction. No special treatments. No sealants that would create preservation conditions. The casket had some water damage, some deterioration. It hadn't been airtight. Air had circulated. Sophia had been in contact with the natural decomposition environment, but she hadn't decomposed. The scientific team published their findings 6 months later. Dr. Santos said. Conclusion: unexplained preservation due to unknown factors. They couldn't explain it. They documented everything: the soil, the casket, the body condition. But they couldn't provide a mechanism, couldn't say why Sophia hadn't decayed. The archdiocese had taken a different approach. They'd interviewed Sophia's family, documented her short life, collected testimony from people who'd known her, and they'd found something interesting. Sophia had been described as unusually peaceful, Dr. Santos said, even while dying, even in pain. She'd comforted her mother, told Maria not to cry, told her she was going somewhere beautiful, 3 years old, dying of cancer, and she'd been comforting the adults around her. The archdiocese had opened an investigation for beatification, the first step toward sainthood. The investigation continued for 2 years. Ultimately, it stalled. Lack of documented miracles. Lack of sufficient evidence of heroic virtue. But Sophia's body remained preserved. Maria had Sophia reburied in a new plot, Dr. Santos said. Requested a above-ground crypt with a viewing window. The archdiocese approved it. And for years, people visited. Thousands of people. Coming to see the sleeping angel. Coming to pray. Coming to witness. Dr. Santos had visited Sophia's crypt several times over the following years, had examined her condition periodically with permission, and she'd remained unchanged. Year after year, no decay, no deterioration, her body maintaining that same peaceful sleeping appearance. But the warmth faded, Dr. Santos said. When I examined her a year later, her body had cooled to ambient temperature, normal for a deceased body. Whatever had caused the warmth I'd felt that first day, it was gone. The scientific community had tried to dismiss the case, called it measurement error, called Dr. Santos's warmth sensation subjective, suggested the preservation was natural, but unusual, a combination of factors that created perfect conditions. They insisted there was a rational explanation, even if they couldn't identify it. But I know what I felt, Dr. Santos said. I'm a forensic pathologist. I've touched thousands of dead bodies. I know what room temperature feels like. I know what body temperature feels like. Sophia's hand was warm. Not imagination, not suggestion. Measurably, noticeably warm. Dr. Santos had struggled with the case for years. It challenged everything he'd been taught, everything he believed about death and decomposition. He'd considered every possible explanation, and none fit. I researched incorruptible saints, Dr. Santos said. Found dozens of documented cases throughout history, bodies that didn't decay, that remained preserved for decades, centuries. The Catholic Church accepts it as miraculous. Science calls it unexplained or fraudulent, but it's documented, photographed, examined by skeptical observers, and Sophia fit the pattern. Sophia Reyes's body remained preserved for 7 years after exhumation. Then, in 2019, decomposition finally began. Slowly, gradually, her skin began to darken. Her features began to change. By 2021, she looked like a body that had been dead for 11 years should look. The preservation had ended. The archdiocese documented the decomposition, Dr. Santos said, filmed it, studied it, and they couldn't explain why it started when it did. Why 7 years after exhumation? Why not immediately? Why not never? Just, it started. And within 2 years, Sophia looked like every other body buried for a decade. Dr. Santos had examined her one final time in 2022, found advanced decomposition. Normal decay, nothing unusual. Sophia had finally followed the biological rules that every other body follows. But that doesn't explain the 7 years, Dr. Santos said. Doesn't explain the warmth. Doesn't explain why a 3-year-old girl buried in tropical soil without special preservation techniques remained perfectly intact for 7 years, while science said it was impossible. Dr. Santos had kept his own documentation, photographs from 2012, showing Sophia looking freshly deceased, photographs from each year showing no change, then photographs from 2019 showing decomposition beginning and his temperature measurements. 32 degrees Celsius on Sophia's hand in June 2012, ambient temperature by June 2013. I've lectured on this case, Dr. Santos said, shown the photographs, explain the conditions, and I always get the same questions. Was it a hoax? Was the body somehow preserved artificially? Was I mistaken? And my answer is always the same. No, no hoax. No preservation techniques. No mistake. This was real. This happened. And I don't know why. He stood up, walked to his window overlooking Quezon City. Outside, Manila traffic crawled past. Normal life, normal world, normal rules of physics and biology. You want to know what I believe? Dr. Santos said. I believe Sofia Reyes was special. I believe something about her death, about her spirit, about whatever it is that makes us human. It stayed. It protected her body. It kept her from decaying for 7 years. And then, when whatever process was happening completed, it let go, and decomposition proceeded normally. He turned back to face me. Science calls that magical thinking, Dr. Santos said. Says I'm projecting. Says I'm allowing emotion to override rational analysis. But I was there. I touched her. I measured her temperature. I examined her over years. And what I witnessed doesn't fit into scientific materialism, doesn't fit into our understanding of death and decay. Dr. Ramon Santos walked me to the door of his office that afternoon, and I left, thinking about Sofia Reyes, about the sleeping angel, about a 3-year-old girl who died of cancer, but whose body refused to decay for 7 years, about a forensic pathologist who touched her hand and felt warmth that shouldn't exist. The rational explanation is that there isn't one. Science documented the case, examined the evidence, and concluded unexplained. Unknown factors, no mechanism identified. But Dr. Santos knows what he felt, knows that warmth was real, knows that Sofia's body violated every rule of decomposition for 7 years, and knows that sometimes, maybe the dead don't follow the rules we've written for them. Maybe Sofia Reyes stayed preserved because some part of her wasn't ready to let go. Maybe her spirit, her consciousness, whatever we want to call it, protected her body, kept her looking peaceful, kept her looking like she was sleeping, kept her warm, at least for a little while. Long enough for her mother to see her one more time. Long enough for thousands of people to witness something impossible. Long enough for science to document it, examine it, and admit it couldn't explain it. And then, when whatever needed to happen had happened, the preservation ended. And Sofia Reyes finally became what every dead body becomes. Dust returning to dust. But for 7 years, she was the sleeping angel. The child who wouldn't decay. The 3-year-old whose body stayed soft and warm and peaceful. Not because of chemicals or casket design or soil composition, but because of something else. Something science can't measure. Something that kept her body beautiful. Long after death should have claimed it. And when Dr. Ramon Santos touched her hand in June 2012 and felt warmth, that was real. That was evidence. That was proof that death sometimes makes exceptions. For the innocent, for the peaceful, for the sleeping angels